Live on Building in Public, and we've got Mark Isero here today. Welcome, Mark.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Yeah, so we were just nerding out on our cameras a little bit, and I think my camera is a Logitech 4K, but it took a lot of fiddling and configuration. So when I'm in this spotlight mode, does it actually look okay by you?
Yeah, I think it does. Yeah.
Okay, and then if I move you to spotlight, does that you
It's a
feel like
little bit
yours?
it's a little bit worse. I think yours is better. Mine's only
Okay.
1080p.
Oh, okay. So that might be the difference. It takes me a lot of fiddling and frustration to get the camera to do what I what
Yeah.
I'd hope.
I was
Oh, and actually,
telling someone this morning, I'm glad that my camera's not that good because I feel like it's just a little blemish remover built in.
Yeah.
So low stress.
and I noticed Andrew showed up, and I think we've got is oh no, Andrew's a different. I was thinking of Andy, a different Andy that we've been talking, DMing with recently. So I thought he might be somebody we know. So anyway, so Mark, I think when we look at your Twitter, we see a few things that pop out. Looks like you're building something, as well as you've got like this. Is it like a newsletter called The Highlighter and a community called Article Club?
Yeah, you're right. And then there's also the Kindle program. And
Mm-hmm.
so, yeah, I just do all these things on the side. They're all hobbies. And
Yeah,
I don't know, like, I'm building them, I guess, but it's
yeah,
more like I just continue to do them. And it's fun.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
So it
that's how the
seems like
best
there's a
student
lot.
starts.
Yeah, I think the best stuff is often, these side projects or hobbies that you do for no other reason than you just have energy for it, and you want it to exist in the world. So that's
Yeah.
perfect.
I love your tagline, I believe in big reading. Just captures both of our hearts. Did you know that Highlighter started as a book annotation?
I was with you from the beginning, and I loved what you were doing at the beginning and what you're doing now. And it seems like you just want to get people together talking about stuff, and talking about ideas. And definitely, I want to do that with reading, just because I think reading, unfortunately, is like too private.
Mhm.
People who read, they get a lot of value with reading, whether it's young people or adults. But it's sort of like you either have it or you don't, and so that's sort of like what I'm about, and like what I believe in with the idea of big reading.
And what is that idea? What is big reading? Is it like big pharma and big tech?
Hopefully not. Hopefully not.
Less evil.
So I taught for 15 years, high school English and social studies, and then now I'm still educator. And with reading, at least for young people, everybody sort of works on it in silos. So you've got a reading specialist, or you have a teacher, or you have the librarian, and nobody really sort of talks about what we're really trying to do together.
Right.
So big reading for me is not just that on the education space, but also just like adults. So like, why do we talk about Netflix on a big scale?
Right.
Why do we talk about movies when we could go to movies on a big scale? There's sort of
Yep.
simultaneity of like what it
Hmm.
means, not just for like discourse and thinking, but also for culture. Like I want more,
Yeah.
I guess I want more people to read and talk about it all publicly, so that
Yep.
there's a little bit more equity with regard to all the ideas that are out there.
Yep. Yeah, totally.
Yeah,
That's
that's so
definitely
true.
close
Yeah.
to our hearts.
Yeah, I
I
mean, I
wonder when
noticed that
you.
in so many, sorry, just gonna say real quick, like in so many group situations, like it's always the Netflix show or whatever. And like those are still really important moments of cultural resonance, but I don't know, there's such a magic to like connecting over books and ideas, and these can be often so timeless. Like you could all be reading something from like the Roman Empire together, but that kind of discussion just, yeah, I totally agree that doesn't happen, especially not really leveraging like what's unique about the internet to make it happen like more frequently and better than it does just over a dinner table with your friends.
Yeah. Yeah, and with books, I'm part of a book club, and I know that you worked on books too. Books are totally transformative. I think they're better than articles or smaller pieces of content, and they change our lives, but they're a big investment. And so my
Hmm.
book club, I am very proud that we all actually read the book, but everybody, all my friends who are part of other book clubs, they're like, that's a huge investment, and nobody actually ever reads. So my idea with Article Club and also just articles in general is
Yeah.
that if we're really all reading the best ones, instead of what we all do, which is just flip through our phones with like content that's not good, then maybe that there's something there.
Yeah, totally. Have you been to any of these like sessions where we've just been reading on Google Docs together?
No, I haven't.
That's something that DK and I started doing actually, because we would be kind of browsing Twitter, find a really interesting like long form piece, and then just copy paste it into Google Docs, collaboratively annotate, and just be on this stream and like be talking about it. And then sometimes the author would pop in, we'd like tag them on Twitter. But I also we're talking about a tweet we saw about a similar content. Let me see if I topic by Nathan Bastiels, who publishes the Every bundle. He was saying like, wouldn't it be great if you could collaboratively learn with people by like co-annotating and reading the best articles together. So I'm so curious what you found with that so far.
So that's part of the article club thing. So there's the newsletter, the highlighter, which of course I like because it's, we share a name together. Mm-hmm. But then article club is so for people to go a little bit more deeply. And that's exactly one of the things that happens is that like, I also copy it onto a Google Doc and then invite folks to group annotate. Mm-hmm. And some months people are really into it. And then some months there's not as much annotation, but I've never had the author actually do it. And I think that's pretty cool. We do have the author either on a podcast or actually in the discussion. We've done that. But like as far as the annotation step, we haven't had authors do that part.
Yeah, I think they would get a kick out of it if you just shared the Google Doc with them. Like as a creator, seeing what resonates, which of your words resonate most with people, what are people highlighting and commenting on, and then I bet they might like be tempted to dig in and start participating in the discussion themselves.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like if you have this Google Doc format, I think is really nice for kind of you being able to curate and make sure that the set of people are interacting in a kind of a in line with roughly the sentiment that you want to explore. But if you sort of take that as a finished work and share it with an author, every author is excited to hear and see that feedback and sort of, understand like, what are my readers thinking? What are they saying? What other directions they want to explore? So I think a lot of writers that we've met, want to figure out, okay, what's my next piece? What are the themes that I should be, kind of, what are the threads I should be pulling, the themes I should be double clicking on? So it seems like it's, that feedback is just, so exciting to people. It's like a great moment to engage somebody. So I think if you're already doing that, just, get more of it out there.
Yeah, I totally agree. So like, for example, even the author who sort of wrote the piece that we had last month, Francesca Mari, and she actually did for Neiman Storyboard. They have a whole annotation thing where the author, actually, I guess they ask the authors some questions within the text, and then the authors sort of annotate. And I think that that's really interesting. What I've found, which is so funny, is that I'm just this random educator, and I cold email these famous authors, and they are so generous and gracious, and they love even though they're only talking potentially to 20 to 40 people, who want to really, they're so happy to get that really direct feedback from their readers.
Yeah, totally. Presumably because you've curated the people who are showing up, they care about the topic, they care about the writing, they're going to give like really high quality feedback. And I think that's something that it's hard for an author to get today. Like if they're showing up in many public places, but the places are, the wide open internet is sometimes like a messy place. Mm-hmm. Whereas if you have like created a context and gotten the right people together in that context, I could imagine even with small numbers, but the quality really matters there.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you because, you have guests and authors and people who are sharing their ideas. And so what I'm sort of thinking about is I don't actually really like in real life where tons of people come and there's like there's like a big stage, right? And then nobody can really ask questions. And then the focus is just on the author. I mean, obviously people come for the author, but what I'm trying to do is like actually having more real conversations and more interaction. And that's really hard to do. Right. And I'm just wondering, like, what's your thinking about how have you tried to do different formats so that there's a little bit more interaction?
Yeah, well, that actually rewinds the clock, actually, I don't know, 5 years or so, where we used to organize these kinds of things offline. And offline's great in many ways because it forces curation and it forces intimacy. And so we would do something kind of like these almost fireside chat type things where we'd invite somebody who's, prominent and has some brand as a topic to come around together. But what we were really trying to do was keep it feeling casual and small enough that everybody can participate and feels okay to participate. And we actually had, because it's offline, you have this like pre-session time and everybody can mingle and bump into each other and catch up with old friends. And then you have kind of the session, but the session already feels warmer because everybody's warmed up.
Yeah.
And then you also have post-event time where people can mingle with the kind of celebrity-ish attendee. These aren't typically huge celebrities, but, somebody that they came to see and to learn from. And I think that person then ends up mingling in the room. So I think the offline, and obviously we don't do much offline stuff these days. I think the offline stuff like has some really, really important details that we don't really have embodied online yet.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's gonna be so interesting as whenever we get to in real life again. Just like, what is the space for true in-person events? What is the space and value of online events? And we just have so much to learn about like what does it really mean to have a valuable online? And that's obviously what it seems like you're working on too.
Yeah. And we definitely thought about this a lot when we were hosting like Zoom town halls with authors, because we always thought about like, ideally it could be more of a bi-directional conversation instead of an AMA type situation where it's just like question, answer, question, answer. But the most magic was when like these authors would start asking back to the audience, like, that was a great question. What do you think? And then it becomes more of a, like, we're all actually truly like equally discussing this piece of work or ideas together. And I wonder, like, I think a lot of it is probably behavioral. Like when we told authors, like, please ask questions back, or like that would be super awesome if you want to solicit ideas from the audience, or make it more of a like brainstorming session or thought lab, we called it once, instead of necessarily like an interview about your thing. Because I also think a lot of people found it really interesting to see how someone's mind works live, like not just rehashing the ideas that they've written before and that maybe like we discussed and annotated together, but like now what are they thinking about, and like how can we plug into that and like be an input into what they might produce next.
Go ahead.
I was gonna say that's a really good point to focus on, is in a sense, the structure or seriousness that you presented to a group of 20 people actually deeply informs how seriously they take it and how structured, how participatory it feels. Whereas if you sort of come with a stated idea that it's more of like a thought lab, you open up the idea that it's not just like listening to a podcast, with like highly edited, highly produced, highly scripted sometimes, but it really opens it up to be more organic and let sort of people's natural energy emerge in the space.
I like that. Yeah, there's value to a lot of different formats. It's just like, are we all on the same page about what's going to happen? And so, for example, at Article Club, I am super clear that it's going to be small, it's going to be live, and actually, especially if the author is there, it's not going to be like a panel. And that's cool. So people know, as you say, like, I've sort of curated the people and the experience so people know about that. Because there is value in different things. It's just like, one thing about Article Club is that I say over and over again, like, one of the rules is that you don't have to appear smart because everybody's already smart. So like, let's just act natural, like, let's just have a good time here, because we've all gone to whatever schooling, we have our degrees or whatever, and really it's around like, why are we here together? And we're here to talk about a wonderful article, and we're here to connect with other people. One of my favorite things is how much connection is possible with total strangers online in very few minutes. Like it's really remarkable. And people say at the end of each one, go ahead.
What do you think makes that work? Is it the content? Is it you as the curator? Is it the space that you set up? Is it presumably some mix of all of that kind of works, but if you had to really if you had to remove everything but one of them, which one would you kind of retain?
I think because it's one a month and there's sort of like a 3-week intro experience over time, then people get to know what exactly they're going to go. So there's I guess an onboarding. And what's interesting is that I started this as an outgrowth of a highlighter, which is a newsletter. And I assumed that there would be all these friends and folks from the beginning who wanted to do article club. And that's actually not true. Article club, because it's on Substack, which is separate, is getting different people. And so I was worried at the beginning, are we going to connect? And I think that for some reason so far, magically, I think it's probably because it is an investment to read a half hour article, and also to annotate it and to go. So I think that people sort of self-select.
Right. Do you have any favorites from Article Club that we could share, like maybe a link to one of the articles that we could share that kind of helps if anybody's sort of watching this after the fact, can kind of get a flavor of what type of thing, like what the severity or brevity or importance of an article in your mind?
Well, one of my favorites from last year was called "The Crane Wife" by C.J. Hauser, and I think it was like last March or April, right when the pandemic was starting. And so this was when Article Club was sort of still getting off the ground. There was like Gia Tolentino, some famous person to start us off, but then C.J. Hauser, who just had written this incredible piece that I just want people to read really great stuff. So I asked her and I said, hey, do you want to even come to the actual session? And she said yes. And at that point, I think there were only 8 or 9 people who were there with her, but that was her favorite thing. It was what you were talking about. There was an actual conversation. She was asking us questions back and forth. And so I think that's one to point to.
Yeah. Okay. I just shared a couple links. I think one is this recording. Is this a podcast you did, or is this a recording of the questions that you guys asked or discussed with her?
Yeah. So I did a podcast with her first, and then she actually joined our live. And what's interesting, and I'd love to get your feedback too, is that so far the actual Article Club discussion has never been recorded. It's this private space, and I don't know how Article Club members would feel about it to be recorded, because obviously it would be really, really valuable. But I also want to have the sanctity of the private space. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah,
that's a tricky one.
Yeah, I think they have very different kind of purpose and the ethos and sort of the feeling around it. We've hosted a lot of book clubs just on a Zoom that would just dissipate at the end, and everything's disconnected. And I think it certainly makes it easy. It's low risk for everybody to participate, right? Because it's there's no residual recording of your participation. But I think it also makes it harder to connect with connect ideas and people. Obviously, across time, you can't connect with the stuff that doesn't exist anymore. So I think a lot of it really comes down to what your goal is for each piece and what the community's goal is in participating. And I think if they're okay being on the record, that's going to benefit a lot more people in the next years, who might discover it and find ways to engage. But it's a different type of personal risk to put yourself out there when it's going to be recorded. And I think the way to mitigate some of that is if you're hosting, if you sort of model that it's okay and we're going to be silly, we're going to be funny, we're going to have fun, it's going to be warm, and it's not going to be this highly scripted. We actually have moved over time from being much more highly scripted to much more this style. We're just exploring these ideas together. Mishy and I used to keep a Google Doc with all of the topics we're going to cover and the backup questions and who we're going to curate in at what time. And we've found that this kind of more lighter weight thing ends up serving the purpose better and helps everybody feel a little bit more comfortable to be themselves.
But also totally depends on the session. Late in the spring and into the summer, pretty much it continued into late fall. I started hosting kind of Article Club, it sounds like, but we did some books, and just after George Floyd, and all of the events of the summer. And a lot of people were hurting, and a lot of people wanted to process and talk just in my neighborhood, but then I ended up getting some random folks as well. But those conversations, I think, would probably be like difficult to record and like have in that format. But those people, after they form that connection, I think that is a group that would have been a great fit for maybe like a different flavor of discussion and event as well. So it's just kind of like different ways of thinking about connection in the community and what kind of events fit best, I think.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yes, I think there's certain topics that I think are going to be, just more sensitive, or people are exploring opinions. They don't necessarily, like something like the George Floyd situation. People don't know how to talk about it, what kind of discussion is going to be well received or acceptable. And so I think that kind of thing probably works best off the record, while people are figuring out how to talk about something that's, an important thing to talk about, but easy to imagine getting wrong in how you express while you're figuring it out. But I think then there's topics like, some of these ones like what we're doing today, talking about like the concept of an article club, or about being able to do these things in public or private. I think I think it's easier for people to address a topic like this without a lot of hesitation in kind of the recording. And we can get things wrong, and if we get things wrong, it's not that big a deal. We can correct them later.
Yeah. What have you found, Mark, to be kind of the most magical moments that come to mind in terms of like connections made in article club, or like unexpected moments of, I don't know?
They happen all the time.
Yeah.
There's just a whole lot of joy that happens on the screen really quickly. I would say that, earlier you were asking about like what's the most important thing that's the like an ingredient. And now that I'm reflecting on it, it's like that there is a sense of a shared experience, even with the annotation and the reading. So it's not like, oh, I read this article 2 years ago and I'm really interested in the author. Mm-hmm. It's something about like that we're in it together, especially there's something I feel magical. Again, I'll say it again, which is like strangers coming together, not just for information or personal satisfaction, but something about connection and community. And so it happens every single time, where even if a person comes back a second time. So one of the things is that I'm not creating like cohorts that meet over time of the same group. Some people have said that, but I haven't really gone in that direction, because I'm into the serendipity. I'm into the sort of, even in the first couple seconds, there's this who's there this time, especially if you come back month after month. And in fact, last time, one person who had been away from Article Club for several months came on, and she just sort of like her face lit up. And then later on, she said, I knew within 2 or 3 seconds, like that I was going to have a really great time, that basically she had missed people. So I think it's interesting. It's the people, I think. And I think that the magic of that there's some possibility, I guess, sometimes like when things get really, really tough, it's sort of like, what kind of connections can there be out there? And so for everybody to come together, I think that's probably the thing that gets me to continue doing it.
Yeah. Have you noticed people continuing on, kind of like forming personal relationships with certain members that they connect with after the fact that they didn't know before, and things like that?
They do. I don't do that as part of, I don't have like a, hey, share your information or whatever, but they have. I guess you can find people if you want to find people.
Yeah, that's so cool. That's something I noticed as well. Like literally, I don't know, the most unexpected kind of serendipitous connections arose out of these shared reading experiences, where people would just find each other on LinkedIn or Twitter or something, or like ask me for someone's email because they really connected about some topic, and then become friends. I think that's like internet magic at its best.
I wonder, have you tried any kind of further nurturing of that? Like, I don't know, a lot of people I see run like a Slack group or something where people can keep in touch, between sessions. If the sessions only happen once every week or every few weeks, something like a Slack or a mailing list might help people form more longitudinal bonds faster, because they just have more kind of daily interaction. Have you played with those ideas, or do you think that's a good fit or not a good fit?
I have thought about it. I'm always into like trying to force something that's good. And also, I don't know if folks have been clamoring for it. So first of all, because I'm an educator, a lot of folks are more educators. And so therefore, Slack hasn't really become a total thing in the education world. Like they would do it, but I think it's more like, what exactly would that be for? What's that community for? And
right.
I think it might become something where nobody really actually goes on to it. In fact, like on Substack, everybody can feel free to add comments, but generally what I'm noticing is that folks don't want to do that either. They just want to like read it, annotate it, and then go to the actual discussion. So yeah, I'm not really sure what to do with that because I know that there's a lot of opportunities, but I haven't gone there yet.
Right. But is it something that you would like to explore? Like you feel like there's energy there, but you're just not sure how you'd want to do it, or?
I think so. Yeah, it's funny because one of the criticisms that I have about reading is that it's all over the place, and yet even the things that I do, they're related, but they're not totally all. And I would like to see a little bit more synergy happening.
Yeah, because I've seen, one example in particular comes to mind is my wife used to organize an offline community, and it was very once every couple weeks, maybe 2 or 3 weeks, they'd come together and have kind of similar fireside chat as I described before. And I think she put together a Slack for that group, and the in-person sessions were super buzzy and everybody was super engaged. But then the Slack, it wasn't sure, like, well, what do I do here? How do I use this? And then separately, she started a separate community that's totally different, but it's entirely on Slack. And like the whole like purpose of coming together is to engage with it. And that one just, is wildly active. And I think a lot of it comes down to like the context people come to the Slack with, or, not Slack in particular, but that kind of tool, like a messaging type tool. Do they come with the right context? And then is there somebody, at least a few people who are kind of like ringleaders and are stirring the pot enough that it feels okay and they model what good behavior is? And so it's like I can imagine if there were an article club Slack, maybe on article club Slack, you just share the best thing you read that day.
Yeah.
And everybody does that. And so you start to understand, oh, you're interested in that topic. So am I. You start to kind of nurture some of those connections, in a way that's much less formal, lower stakes, but gives you sort of an excuse to connect every day. So I think some of it could be just, it's not so much the tool, but it's like how you use it and what kind of behaviors you want to encourage or nurture or model.
Yeah, I like that idea because at this point, I choose the articles. People can sort of recommend, but ultimately it is a little bit top down. And so if it's really community that I'm looking for, then and I want people to talk, then they should be able to sort of talk amongst themselves as well.
Yeah. Where have you been finding people coming from? Has it been pretty scattered all over the place, whoever finds you on Substack, or concentrated around like geographic location to start with, or how has that been sort of developing over time?
I think it's pretty random, but it's all based on word of mouth, just because people at the beginning knew me, but then and then they just shared it from there. And then as far as like article club, because it's on Substack, then it's like totally random, and it's like more international than I thought that it would be. So there's some folks coming from there. The most interesting thing is the folks who are on the list who get the posts and the emails, but they're just there to sort of like watch. And my question is, okay, what are they doing? What are they interested in? If the key thing is the discussion, like what does it take? Should I encourage them? I have this idea that I want everybody to try it out if they want to, but I don't want to like force it. And this whole thing about, even though I believe in big reading, I also believe that big reading should still stay small as well.
Right.
Yeah. So we'll see. I'm just going to continue, doing what I'm doing.
I love it. I want to join. I'm going to come to your next one.
Please. Yeah, please do. Yeah, please do.
And are you also teaching, like, I saw that you're director of humanities for Envision. Are you also teaching like reading and English to students, or was that your background?
Yeah, my background was with high school students, and then now I work with teachers as an instructional coach, as well as
Hmm.
like a charter network administrator. But I'm also deciding, as a lot of people are,
Yeah.
like what is my potential next step too, and I'm trying to figure out like what speaks to me with regard to reading. Just
Yeah.
because I see it, like when I was a teacher, I really, really saw it. And it wasn't just in academic skills and outcomes. It was also just sort of like a really quiet confidence that students had when they appreciated and understood like what reading could do for them, either in
Yeah.
school or outside. And it was just sort of like this sense of confident peace, where you could almost identify a young person if they had sort of like a strong interaction and strong relationship with reading, and whether they identified as a reader.
Right. I
Yeah.
mean, this seems like such a a big area to explore. I wonder, like, do you have any kind of anchors that would feel like true north to you? Like, do you want to work with small groups one on one? Do you want to expand your instructional, kind of educator focused programs? Would you want to start a new programming thing from scratch that addresses a different audience that you haven't engaged with deeply yet?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that I'm most drawn to like a school setting because it's like part of a community,
Mm-hmm.
and and so sort of at that scope, although I'm always thinking about different ways. But I think that the most important thing is that if you're a person who cares about reading with young people, you actually have to know how it's actually done. And so over the last couple of years, there's a whole lot of more research about the science of reading. And so you can't be about reading and then actually not know how young people learn to read. So I think that even though I care about sort of like this big reading thing, I also want to make sure that I'm working with individual students as well. So there's just
Yeah.
there's a lot of different ways. There's working with teachers. There's like the focus of how do you build a reading culture at a school or in a community or in a network. You have to have a lot of different things going on. Like some people say that, oh, let's just have a lot of different books and just have books everywhere. You have classroom books and library, but that's also not enough.
Mm-hmm.
So you need to have like a lot of different things happening. And some folks are saying, oh, you should be like looking into the tech space as well. So far, what I've noticed is that that's mostly on the nitty gritty intervention. It's all about,
Hmm.
I don't necessarily, it's helpful. It's helpful as an additional resource, but I haven't seen tech really go into reading too much yet.
When you say the intervention, what does that mean?
So what it does is that it provides really quick data of a screening about the young person's reading strengths and areas of growth, and then it really does a good job of pinpointing like what the student needs to do, and it offers practice. But what it doesn't do is say why reading's great. And what it doesn't do is it doesn't
Yeah.
actually teach the specific phonological and phonemic pieces that
Mm-hmm.
actual humans need to do.
Yeah. Yeah, I was gonna ask actually, because I'm sure you've worked with students for whom like they just grew up reading, they love it, they're already kind of readers, and that's great. But for the ones who haven't like felt the magic and haven't felt the motivation to, do you think that's like what are schools not doing, or what could kind of help discover that? Do you think it's like more peer-to-peer connection, like using reading as a basis to connect with someone else in your classroom, or to connect with something bigger than just that? Is that what's not happening, and how do you make that happen?
Yeah, I think it's hard to generalize because it's dependent on each school.
Yeah.
I've seen a lot of different things. So, for example, yes, some schools may need to do more work on personal identity. Like, what is reading? how do I interact with reading? What's my reading autobiography? How do I see reading being valuable to me as I get older? I'm speaking specifically for secondary, because that's been my thing. But others, as you say, social is important too. So when I was a teacher, and I would get so many different copies of the same book because friends would read the same book and have their own, and then they got excited about reading there. But I think the biggest thing that I'm really noticing is that you can do all of this stuff with regard to making reading exciting and meaningful. But I think too many educators, because we are educated and we like reading already and we went to college, we, especially secondary teachers, do not totally appreciate that a lot of young people say that reading's boring just because we haven't actually dealt with the reading itself. And so there's maybe one reading specialist for hundreds of students. And that's just not going to be enough. And especially when you have teachers that haven't been trained on specifically the science of reading, then you have stuff that doesn't directly relate to the problem.
Do you think that it sounds like there's a lot of, I guess, let's call it, I don't know if this is the right term, but kind of the tactics of how the reading process and learning process works. And then, there's this part of kind of aspiration to be connected to, a social environment, meaning other classmates even. And I wonder, is there a lot of research already on ways, maybe techniques that could be used or tactics that could be introduced to make those bonds stronger or to help people, care about reading because, in a sense, the same reason that people care about the same songs on TikTok is because that's what everybody's doing. So they want to kind of understand and be connected to the stuff that everybody else is into. So is there a major thread of research around that, or is that something that there's specific things you can do to address?
I think that we probably need to do more work in that, because everybody believes in reading that it's sort of important. But there's also this assumption that you either know how to read or you don't. And there's more of a fixed mindset with regard to reading rather than growth. And so, and it's always assumed that it's already done in first and second grade, rather than actually development over time. So what you're saying, I feel like you're talking about a connection, between those things. I think that's a really, really interesting idea.
Actually, we talked about this before. So this is one thing. My sister is in college, and she was taking a really tricky philosophy class, and I studied philosophy. And so literally, I would get on Zoom, or this is when I was home. Also, be on her PDF together, and we would just read it quietly to ourselves, but at the same time, and by seeing what I was highlighting and sort of the notes I was scribbling on the side, I think she actually learned a lot about how to read that kind of writing. And then it struck me that that is something that's not really you never think about cultivating skills in reading in that way after you just know the basics of how to read a sentence. More about extracting what's valuable and summarizing and comprehension and critical thinking off of that. It's just kind of all right, you know how to read, we'll test you on some content in high school and see if you remember the color of the neighbor's house. And I'm sure that reading for different disciplines is so different. So if I were to do that, except I was learning how a physicist read a science paper, I would learn a lot from that, just watching.
It goes back to annotation, but also it is about disciplinary literacy, because it is true, different disciplines read in different ways, and reading is, again, so private, so invisible. Secondary teachers, for example, do all of this writing, and writing is beautiful because it's out there and you can work on something together. But how do we actually work on reading together? It's much, much harder because everybody just assumes it's all in our brains.
Have you played with any tools I'm not deep on it, but I know a lot of people talk about these Rome research book kind of knowledge hubs. Have you played with any of those? Are you familiar with any of the community around that?
I'm a little stressed out by Rome research because it partly intrigues me, but I worry about going down that path. But that is, I think, what reading is too. It's really around the networking of ideas, and especially there's a lot of research that says that better readers actually have more background knowledge, because when they approach a new text, there's more to sort of connect. And so, I do think that it is a Rome research situation.
because I wonder if, in a sense, Rome feels to me like a highly networked, and it's not social in the way that, like, I don't know, Instagram or Snapchat is, but it's a people centric approach to note taking and collaboration. And to me, that it feels that that's something of what a classroom, maybe in a neo classroom might be in its best form, is something where people are really coming together and contributing their ideas and noticing other people's. And so there's this, in a sense, like a escalation game that's played, like, oh, you said something cool, I want to say something else smart. And so it kind of, in a sense, you're competing to lift everybody up. Everybody competes to be better together. And I don't know if that, maybe it only works once people are past a certain threshold of the basics of reading skills, and onto topics. And there's probably other certain kind of nerd tendencies that it tickles for us, but I wonder if there are ways to sort of take some of those ideas and bring them to, make them more accessible, or make it easier for people to kind of, I think of it as a competition, but that's not a leaderboard or a video game, but it has these moments like, bring your best stuff here and show up at the party where everybody's best stuff is showing up.
I like that. I like that, because the traditional way that reading is taught at the secondary is either we all figure out what the author intended, which is important, but it's like there's like one answer, right, or we figure out what the teacher intended.
Right.
It's not about what we all think as learners. And
right.
Reading should be inquiry, and reading should be bringing yourself to the text fully. And so, yeah, it's funny, like what I do with adults with Article Club should be happening with young people every day in their classrooms.
So do you think that can happen in classrooms, or is there something structural around how coursework is structured in the classroom that wouldn't allow an Article Club-like process to make its way into a classroom?
No, I definitely think it could happen as long as there's honesty about what's actually happening with the reading. So there's a couple things. Is there enough reading, enough opportunities for students to try and to succeed and to grow? I think some teachers are scared of reading, especially complex texts, because, the students aren't going to understand it. The second thing, too, is that there's got to be honesty with where the students actually are with regard to the text. And so there's a game where the teacher will assign reading, the students will say that they have read, right. Everybody knows that nothing is actually, and then there's this weird game.
It's like the big charade.
Yeah, so as long as we're really honest with what's happening, then yes, I do think it's possible.
I mean, I think the best honesty comes when people are just like feeling the energy for it. It's not like they don't have to be told to do it. They're just like, oh, I want to do this, because it's like, this is, I mean, imagine like on a playground, people must be trying to show off, look, I learned this new way to throw a ball, or, hit some, I don't know, all of the ways. But whenever you create like a space for people to like up level and show what they've accomplished or what they've seen or heard, or, kind of their own view, it's just like, it's like core self-expression. And then it's like, it's the desire to, make your own contribution. So yeah. I'm intrigued by, I always think about like incentives, like what are the things that would create the motivation in somebody to actually care, not because like an educator told them to care, or their parents told them to care, or they heard that college is this important thing they want to achieve, but just that like in their social environment, they look better and they look smarter, or they look cooler, or whatever, whatever they want is achieved because they contribute in this way.
Yeah, I totally agree. And, just because adults all have newsletters now, like young people should have newsletters and reading stuff, and people should like connect on what they care about. That's something unfortunately that I don't see enough of sometimes, because schooling sometimes is prescribed. And it's this idea of like, there's just so much cool stuff that we can learn about and know about, especially at the secondary level. Like sometimes we get all sad that young people, as they get older, their curiosity goes down. There's so many systemic reasons for that, but there are things that we can do to like continue and to build and to promote curiosity.
Right. Do you think that at the age range you're talking about, do people think about reading as very distinct from writing?
That's a good question. I would say yes. Although we all know and they know that if there's more of a connection, then that's when they feel more powerful.
Right. Because I almost wonder how closely somebody's kind of, moment of delight as a writer may drive them to be caring about being a better reader. Like if you mentioned if, maybe people in Article Club have a Substack, but that maybe people in a school setting at that age would not, at the younger ages. And I wonder if there's something where you could, encourage a lightweight, low stakes kind of writing that would help people, like when you have to create or when you want to create, you actually need to pay attention if to learn the best of it. You need to observe, well, he does it that way, maybe I can do it that way.
I think that's great because like young people know about being a creator and everybody is, and they really appreciate that. But for some reason, the way that reading is sometimes constructed in schooling is that it's just a text that does not even have an author. So I think that the more that teachers can sort of introduce young people that, hey, this text is coming from this author. What do you think about this author? And sort of like humanizing it more, then maybe young people will see that writing is a creation too, which they do with poetry and fiction, but with nonfiction, sometimes they think of it as just information. That's why I love TikTok. So TikTok for young people, they really see that there's creators, there's folks who are responding, and they see how knowledge and discourse happen. But for I guess what I'm saying is I would love classrooms to be a little bit more like TikTok, where young people are creating stuff, learning stuff, being curious, and building off of each other.
Right. Yeah, I like the idea of like the lower stakes. Like when you think about like what it takes to make a video on YouTube compared to what it takes to make a video on TikTok, you just like dramatically lowered the barrier. And like you don't have to have a channel with lots of people subscribing. You don't have to have like beautiful thumbnail and bottom thirds and intro music. You just like do your thing and that's enough.
Yeah.
And I when I think about sort of my writing education, when you talk about like poetry, there's like poetry feels to me a little bit more like making a YouTube video. Like here's the rules, here's how we do things in poetry, poetry world traditionally. And those are good to learn, but I wonder if there's some like little fragment of like a very simple one that doesn't require the thumbnail that perfect and doesn't require the bottom thirds, but really lets you get started just doing something that can graduate up,
Yeah, that's absolutely.
I don't know, something like a daily journal of like the, one sentence thought on your mind. I don't know if is that something that's practiced at all, or is there like a place for that?
In some places. Yeah. In some places.
Mm-hmm. And it does give way to this thing. Actually, Eugene, I don't know if you've read any of Eugene's writing, but Eugene, who's joining us in a few minutes, is he's been prolific at writing about TikTok, and it's a topic that he cares about a lot. And I'd say he's probably like maybe the most, kind of the most studied and analytical thinker and writer on TikTok, which is saying something given, how broad TikTok is. But I think one of the most interesting ideas that he kind of raised in our mind when we chatted with him last was this idea of like a creativity network. And that is that it's not the fact that the format of the video matters as much as the fact that you can take somebody else's video and kind of remix it into your own. And so it's not the video creation tool, but it's the people that you're creating with in a sense that makes it, often magical. And that can be directly creating the video or using the music and the dance moves that everybody else is using, and you're doing your own inspired take on it. So I wonder if that creativity network effect can be, can be brought into education, which also reminds me of another one we have. I think we didn't do this in public, but we had a private session a couple weeks ago where we did improv games. I wonder if you played with improv games much?
They're amazing. They stress me out, but they're amazing.
Yeah.
Do you do them in a educational setting? Is that?
Yeah, and with young people and with adults. they're perfect, improv, role playing, all that stuff where you actually have to embody and take on different characters as well, and continue it's amazing, and create together.
Yeah. I found there was one of the games we played was kind of this, you're sort of setting a scene and then building on somebody else's and adding and adding. It's almost like the game of telephone, but in a positive way where you're sort of expressing each one. And it feels much easier to be creative once everybody's agreed to be creative together and somebody breaks the ice with like the first moment. And then it becomes this like escalation of, oh yeah, but what about this? Oh, and I'm also doing this. I'm also doing that. And I wonder if some of those same ideas, that kind of collaborative, kind of creativity network could help us design new systems or tools or processes to get, young people motivated to create in this format. And if you learn to create in this format, then you also care to consume in the format. And I'm not sure, which comes first, the chicken or the egg, but I just like the idea of like taking some, borrowing a concept maybe from improv and borrowing another concept from TikTok and seeing if are there ways to sort of help drive new motivation for people to become writers and readers at a young age.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when I think about back to like my most transformative educational experience, obviously before TikTok and stuff, like it's always about making something. So for me, it was like the high school newspaper. It could be like theater. It could be like band. It could be sports or whatever. It's all about teamwork. It's about building something and creating something.
Yeah.
And it's not individualistic either. It's not just for your own. You might get an individual grade or you might get a solo or whatever, but it's always about something in community. And it's so interesting. It's like when you ask a young person, what is their most transformative educational experience? They don't often say English 10.
Right.
Yeah. But why not? Like, why can't we do that? Where it's about groups of people, young people getting to, like, that's one of the best things about serendipity in a classroom is that nobody exactly knows who's going to be there for an entire year. And so you might as well make it into sort of a lab space.
Yeah. Yeah, that's so true. I so agree. Like when I think about high school English classes, they were never, it was always just so focused on how can we, maybe it goes back to the testing system, but working back from tests, like how do you assess whether someone has read something? If your way is to like quiz them on some like irrelevant facts about the narrator's life or whatever in a chapter, instead of maybe like cut down on the volume of reading that's expected and then focus less on how do we deeply test like whether someone has absorbed every piece of content, and more like how can you use that as a springboard for creating something else or talking about something else. It's like naturally you'll want to do well when you're like playing with other people. If that's your like base idea, you're going to consume it, you're going to read it, and you're going to be engaged with it like automatically.
Yeah, I agree, because it's also about notions of rigor also. So like rigor in an English class is how many books are you going to cover?
Right.
How many pages can you say that your students are quote unquote reading, rather than like rigor is all around application and about like, what are you doing with the content? And how are you like using it? So
do you think that being in traditional educational systems, you said that one of the pieces of value you get is being connected to a community of people kind of going through that education process. I wonder, are there people who have, within that educational process, do you think, who are looking for some of these, I guess, I don't know if you'd call them more experimental or a little bit, fringe ideas to incorporate in the classroom? Are they generally like accepting of, instead of the metric being how many books or how many words, it's going to be some other metric that is yet to be established? Do you think you'd find that palatable?
Yeah, definitely. There's definitely a movement, and for the last really 20 years, actually, about project-based learning. And so it really is around depth rather than breadth. And it's really super powerful, but also it has to be done well, too, because if you really reduce the content, which is the best thing to do, you have to actually be able to create these really transformative and magical experiences. Because if you don't do it well, then you just have even less going on.
You get
So
worst of both worlds, right? You need to, it's like a risk to reduce it, but then you need to get some, hopefully even better benefit from having done so.
yeah.
Cool. Well, I know we're wrapping toward the end of kind of our first hour. But I think this has been a super fun discussion. I'm sure we'll find plenty of interesting highlights from it. But I was going to suggest we could end with one of the questions that we often pose to our guests who come on here, which is kind of broadly outside of, I mean, could be inside, but even outside of the topics that we've discussed today. Is there anything right now, like what are the topics on your mind that you're just most curious about, or that you're sort of the questions you have for the world?
That's a great question. The thing that most comes to my mind is around connection. We talked a little bit about it already, whether it's through reading or whether it's through having people convene. And it's not just because of the pandemic, but I really do believe that we're very isolated from each other. We're very segregated. We don't talk to each other. I still believe in connection, and I still believe in, especially folks who don't know each other, to listen deeply. And so that's the thing that I think maybe I'm really thinking about, not just in my own life, but also with my friends and family and in the work that I do.
It's great. More connection.
Yeah.
Yeah. And thanks so much. And thanks so much for having me.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you. This made my day.
Thanks for spending the time. That was a lot of fun. Yeah.
Yeah. Great. Thank you so much.
See you.
All right. And let's see, we've got Menelaus. I don't think I've met Menelaus before. Do you know Minnie?
Mm-mm.
Hi, Minnie. How are you doing? I wonder if Minnie came to hear from Eugene.
Yeah. Should be on soon.
There he is.
Henry said he'd stop by too.
Oh, cool.
Thinking a lot about video and stuff. Oh, awesome.
Right. I was trying to remember if I had seen anything that Eugene has published lately, because it feels like whenever he publishes something, kind of, at least my corner of Twitter lights up.
Yeah. The TikTok
Hey,
one,
Eugene.
I think. Was
Hey.
Hello.
Hey, good. How is it?
I'm good.
Welcome back.
New camera setup.
Yeah, sort of. It's a little weird, but
what's a little? Yeah, do you have it? Do you have it on an adjustment? Is that on our side?
I don't know. It looks squeezed, but
it does look a little squeezed. We had somebody looking a little squeezed yesterday too. So I wonder if are you using an external camera?
Yeah, it's the USB.
Which one is it?
It's like it's just a Sony SLR.
Oh, okay, cool.
Yeah. But it's fine. Makes me look skinnier. It's good.
Cool. Well, thanks for coming back. I think last time we chatted was, I want to say, I don't have the date in front of me. It must have been 9 months ago or 6 months ago.
It was like the fall.
Wow. Yeah, I know.
We were still on Zoom doing town halls on Zoom.
all pandemic time is, just group it all together. It's no difference.
Sometime in 2020.
Yeah. Pre
getting our vaccines.
Yeah.
Kind of all in process now.
Yeah. It's a relief. I got my first shot on Thursday, so it's good.
Oh, you did? How are you? Are you holding up okay?
Yeah, I had a sore arm for a little bit, but that was good. It made me feel like it was actually doing something.
Yeah, I'm almost 24 hours into my first shot. Just got yesterday. Yeah, and I'm okay. I'm okay. My wife is a little over 24 hours in, and she is not doing as well. She's pretty worn out from it, but yeah, so far so good.
Yeah.
So we'll see.
Yeah. So, what have you got going on? I hear you're working on some new things.
Yeah. So we, we've, I think it was about, going on about a year ago, we were starting to experiment a lot with how we wanted to host these author sessions. And so we're using Zoom and hosting a lot of these author sessions. Mm-hmm. And we wanted to be able to record them and publish them to YouTube and have an asset around and have the community that gathers around the thing all in the same place long term. And so we actually did a bunch with Zoom and found that Zoom was really good to help us figure out what we want, but then we found, half a dozen ways or more that Zoom wasn't really serving the way we wanted to use it. Yeah. So in kind of to rewind on Highlighter, the initial vision with Highlighter has always been, and continues to be, to sort of take these atomic units of information in the world and to pull them out and make them interactable and discussable. And so, initially we were doing that with an OCR highlighting app for physical books. But now we're actually doing it as kind of this video creation and highlight curation. So today a highlight is a clip of a video that we create together here. Mm-hmm. So we sort of reworked everything and sort of, we don't even focus on the other stuff anymore. We just focus on this core experience, which is, make videos together, publish them out, save the video, compose the stream, create the highlights. And that's kind of where we are as a product overall. So that's a little bit of the catch up. And then we were talking to Sonal the other day and she said, oh, you should talk to Eugene. He's, has obsessed with video and has lots of thoughts around the future of video and new tooling that's needed and all kinds of stuff. So, I thought that'd be fun to share what we're up to and kind of get your thoughts on that, and also hear what else you're thinking about.
Yeah, I think we're still early, right, in figuring out what like kind of a video first world looks like. In many ways, I think when I'm in China, I sort of get a sense, right? Their internet kind of came of age in an era when smartphones had video cameras. And so you just see like much more video interspersed through all their apps. And actually, I think the most sort of like interesting user interfaces of this past, of like the 2010s were probably Snapchat and TikTok, partially because they open into sort of like a full screen vertical camera view. It takes over your entire screen. And it's sort of saying, like the camera is the main, interface. And then the entire like, they basically entirely take over your mobile operating system and just replace it with an entirely new interface. Of course, the rest of our phone is still on like the first gen, concept of what like a mobile OS should look like. But, there's probably room to push even further if we were to say, what if, an interesting experiment would be, what if we didn't even have text as a medium? How would everything change from an interface perspective?
And what is that, when you're thinking about not having text, you mean like you're saying no text messaging clients, or you're saying no text at all on the phone? Everything's this visual.
Yeah, no text at all. Like just to force yourself to grapple with like, oh, what does that world look like? It is just like odd for me when I go to China, how much more I use video and audio as like dominant mediums. Like in China, a lot of people send audio snippets rather than texting people.
Yeah.
And if you look at kids, right, they snap more than they text almost. I don't know about that exact stat, but like my sense is when they talk to each other using Snap, they don't usually, type out text messages.
Right.
They're just like, oh, it's just more efficient to say it into.
Right.
And it's more expressive, right? The human face is more expressive, the voice. You're leaving out a lot when you go to text. It's hard for me because I'm of a older generation, so I still predominantly text. I don't like snap with my peers. But sometimes I feel like if, that's like one of those generational transitions where I'm like, I just feel outdated.
Right.
Yeah.
Now, I think oh, go ahead.
Oh, I was gonna say it's funny because I've also noticed like there are people who I exclusively like voice note with, and then others who I just text with, and kind of depending on where they are in the world. Like a lot of people in India do voice notes, or my friends in Europe even. But it feels more lightweight in a sense, but also more heavyweight at the same time, like to consume. Like I
Yep.
have to sit down and be in a quiet space and like listen to this person's 2 minute voice note to myself. So just this thought experiment about a world where there was no
Yeah.
text and only video, I think, and what we are thinking about a lot also is just information density and how do you convey the most salient bits like quickly and
Yeah.
increase the rapidity of that cycle.
Yeah, for sure. That's actually just what I was about to say, which is the one unsolved problem for video and audio right now is that it gates the consumer's consumption speed.
Mm-hmm.
It's not as scannable, and we haven't done as good a job of indexing video to be able to search through it to find the relevant bits. We're starting to get bits of it. If you do searches on YouTube, sometimes for a very specific thing, like how to, I don't know, take the pit out of a cherry or something. Sometimes they will actually index inside of a video and take you
Right.
to the time code and skip over all the irrelevant stuff. And over time, I think that'll get easier. We'll make video more indexable, and the same for audio, especially when speech to text gets good. Then you essentially can like convert it to text and then
Yeah.
run your standard search algorithms against it. So I'm of the mind that I think I remember hearing a story about the Alexa team early on. One of the constraints that someone put on them was that, hey, everything has to be done through the voice. Like all menus and commands need to be doable through voice. I actually am more of the mind that like ultimately our future will be multimodal. So you can think of the problem in two directions. One is input, like how do I input data into this computing device? And then the other side is output, like how do I get information out? And I think we'll want to support a world where you choose the most efficient method at that time for each of those things, right?
Totally. Yeah.
So sometimes it's faster for me to be at a keyboard and type. Sometimes I can't because I'm cooking, my hands are dirty, and voice is the easiest thing for me. And the same in the reverse direction. Sometimes I want to be able to just hear feedback given to me in audio form because I can multitask. I can, just listen to my AirPods. And sometimes the fastest way to express something to me is to show it to me on a screen, if a screen is available. And then eventually with haptic feedback, you'll have another sense, right? You'll be able to use touch. And so I think it'll be like in both directions, right? Because like we may have these like VR gloves in the future that we're wearing that give us another way of inputting information into a device. So yeah, I think the future will be one which is just richer in both directions. You'll have like many choices of input and then many choices of output.
Yeah, that's cool. That idea seems right. It seems like the idea of being able to, do what works best for you and let the technology take care of the kind of translation of medium. I think we already start to see some of these examples in like how even just like human language translation works, where you can, I think there's now been some experiments or kind of products even launched recently that let you speak in your language and let a listener listen in an alternative language that just on the time processes. But I wonder, when you think about that problem space, are there, how do we get there? Are there paths that seem promising to get there? Like, is it going to be solved like a text to audio or text to video thing on the production side and then let a bunch of people consume in one or more of those modalities? Or is it going to be, let creation happen on one side and then let people consume in one fixed modality? Do you sort of imagine what maybe a likely path would look like, or kind of how to think about the patterns that might get us there?
I don't know for sure yet. I know there have been experiments with like, hey, there are like software programs you can use to write things that can be compressed to different levels of density, I guess. You can write a long essay and then it can be reduced to a shorter piece if you only have like 5 minutes, and it can be reduced to one line if you only have. But I find that puts a lot of those programs that I've tested still put a lot of onus on the creator, right? And I think the only scalable, extensible way ultimately is we're going to have to use some level of machine learning where that type of compression happens automatically. It's just like we understand the context of the consumer better,
right?
And we're able to deliver the right, the information in the right format at that moment for that person. And part of that, I think, will come with more awareness of that person's context. We're sort of stuck in this privacy debate right now, which is like very binary. It's kind of like either you have to share everything, and it's just out there in the world, or it's just like Apple privacy model, like you don't share anything and you don't know anything about this person.
Right.
I actually think we need an alternative path, which is that I think that people are willing to share more about their context if they feel like that will be used solely to deliver some amount of value to them, and then not be abused or like widely disseminated. And there's certainly room now with encryption and crypto and everything where I think you can choose an alternative path that's not black and white. And so you can imagine in that world, right, where I'm like, hey, I actually want to share a lot more about my tastes, my life, like where I am right now. Eventually, we're going to have, with Apple Watch and future medical devices, you'll have even, right, like biological feedback at any given moment. And based on all of that, I think, the product or service will be able to deliver at a much higher resolution for like what makes sense for that moment. We don't quite have that yet. That's almost like a new field of design, I think, that will come about as we start to get more and more of this resolution. But I, for example, would be happy to share that information if I thought that would, come back to me in value. For example, like I sometimes I'll go shop at some new retail store that's never, heard of me before. I'm a first-time user.
Right.
And I wish, all these like clothing sites would just like, I had one like profile of my bodily dimensions and my tastes in clothing, and they could instantly personalize their store and say, hey, this is the item for you. This is the size, based on what, you've shared about yourself. But it doesn't. And I have this with streaming sites where essentially Netflix has one profile of my viewing tastes, Amazon Prime has another one, HBO Max has another one, Disney Plus has another one. But I'm just one person with, one set of tastes. I'd be happy to share my taste profile across all those sites if it helped me navigate their like, screen full of thumbnails and find the thing that I wanted to view. The problem is in the West, we've developed a very vertically siloed view of consumers, right? And in many ways that almost doesn't make sense to me. We always say like, hey, like in the Silicon Valley, people always say, oh, user-centered design or user-centric thinking. But when you have a siloed view of people, that's almost impossible, right? Every site only can see what that person has done on their site. And that ultimately leads to like a suboptimal outcome for each user. So I think if we were to rebuild the internet today, you would say, well, identity, payments, even the social graph should logically actually be horizontal layers of the internet, not like held by privately controlled, like vertically oriented corporations.
Right.
And in a way, right, like some parts of the world that are building their internet later, I think will correct for that mistake. Even China doesn't quite have this, but because WeChat is the dominant identity platform for the entire nation, they kind of do have a horizontal identity layer, right? Like everybody has WeChat. Whereas in the West, you could say like, well, my friend doesn't use whatever, Facebook or Instagram, or like you kind of have to go find people where they are. But in China, it's like, I don't know a single person in China that I can't find on WeChat. Now, I don't know that in the West we want like one company to own that layer, but maybe if there was a way to do it where the user had control of their information.
Right. So it sounds like, a lot of the themes that people talk about in like decentralization, discussions broadly. And I wonder, are there any patterns there that you're particularly drawn to, or ones that you're maybe more skeptical of? That there's a lot of like popular narratives, I guess, arising around decentralization.
Yeah, I think the issue with most things when it comes to decentralization is that right now, it still comes to the fact that most users don't actually care if things are decentralized or not. They just want a good experience.
Yeah.
And so a lot of decentralization efforts, I think, suffer from using a lot of buzzwords that ultimately don't convince the user to make the switch. You're going to have to build something that's both compelling, like as an experience, and then also maybe has that architecture behind the scenes. But you have to make that case, right? Like people generally tend to just use what's most convenient.
Right. And
so,
in the case of WeChat, like part of what works about it is that it's highly centralized, maybe even more centralized than the messaging ecosystems in the West, right?
Right.
Did those come about through, is it kind of just a standard market evolution from having come later that happened, or was there some other kind of government, corporate partnership, or how does that kind of thing emerge in China?
It's like all of the above in some ways. Of course, there's the classic leapfrog effect, right? You don't have to be tied to legacy systems if you don't have them at all. So when China's internet finally came about, they could, a number of things. They could study and learn from the West on the one hand. They could skip over, any legacy things in the West that still had a lot of market share because they didn't have them. They didn't have a lot of personal banking or an extensive, personal or credit card usage. They didn't have a big legacy of using desktop, laptop computers. Like most people couldn't afford to have one. And so they only had mobile phones. And then they could afford to just lean into, hey, we live in a world where mobile phones now are pervasive and the internet is pervasive and phones are always connected to the internet. And all of those things kind of combined allowed WeChat, and WeChat also focused first on messaging. There wasn't like this huge legacy SMS system that they had to fight. And we know that messaging is probably the most used like thing on a phone. So just like the usage rate is super high. So they started from the perfect high frequency use case.
Yeah.
And then network effects of that just like took over and it just kind of like became dominant. And from that's such a solid base to build from because you have identity and you have communication. So you have like identity and a social graph. And now you can just layer on top of it. They layered on top of it payments in WeChat Pay. Layered on top of it, all sorts of like, B2C services. And they essentially became the dominant, right, like interface for that country. Like I always call WeChat the operating system of China.
Right.
I think it's confusing. There's two things that I always tell people when I come back from China to the West that always I think a lot of people don't really understand. One is that people in China almost never use the web. Like they don't open the web browser, browse the web. Like everything is done through apps pretty much.
Yeah.
And the second thing is they don't really use email. Like, and I use email in the web like almost every day in the web, right? Like, it's just like every hour almost I'm on those things. And in China, they don't use those at all. Like, I don't know how to explain how different the internet is in China. Just like that, you never do that. If I try to email someone in China, they're always like, "Oh God, like, could you just do it through WeChat?" Like, why? I don't want to open email. I never open email. I'd only open it to just communicate with you. It's just such a pain.
I think there's also an age thing in the US, right? Like, I think the same patterns you're mentioning, like no web and no email, are also probably pretty common. Maybe not as common as they are in China, but I think they're common in like a 20-something in the US.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
And again, that's that thing, right? Like in the West, we're just saddled with like a legacy. And so it takes, what's the saying? There's that saying that says like, all substantial change is just generational. You really ultimately just like need people to die for like some of these habits to be broken. I do feel that sometimes. I have like I have some things that I use now that make, like, even just the fact that I'm using a laptop right now, makes me just like, so different from people in China. In a way, there's such a, they are, right. Like when you say young people are like this now, that's where I think, it's interesting that we have these siloed internets around the world, because it allows us to see the future. And sometimes the future is not in the West anymore. Right. Sometimes the future is happening in other parts of the world. And I think that's exciting. That's why I always learn a lot from going to China, just seeing how they interact with the internet there.
Yeah, I wonder, in China, do you have much kind of experience? I know you've talked about some stuff, and I even see a question from Henry about kind of the content side of things. And I wonder, in China, does it have what's the interplay between kind of the content, kind of as a content creation industry, if there's kind of a Hollywood, like, kind of movie production, TV production, and kind of the technology networks where that content information gets distributed? Are those also tightly coupled, or?
Yeah, I mean, you certainly see it with like influencers and live streaming. Like, we don't have as big a live streaming commerce market in the West. I think there's a number of reasons for that, like including the nature of our sort of e-commerce infrastructure makes it a little bit harder. But certainly, right, in China, almost all the companies that do live streaming video have some sort of like production wing, and they work hand in hand with all of the content creators, right, to improve their live streams. They will actually like bring them in, train them, teach them how to do their hair and makeup and sound and video. They'll have studios where they help film this stuff. And when I watch live streams in the West, I always just feel, wow, they seem so much more amateurish, less polished. In China, live streaming, if you look at the top live streamers in China, they're like TV anchors. They're super polished. They know exactly what to do. They've been doing this, whatever that 10,000 hour rule. But, you look at someone like Li Jiaqi, the lipstick guy, who's really famous for his Taobao live streams. That guy's done, he spent like 3 years doing live streams around the clock before he broke out. So he has just a lot of practice under his belt.
Yeah. I want to get Henry up also, because he was sort of like touching on and I know he's thinking about this a lot with what he's building, but he was touching on like how will the kinds of stories that get produced be impacted by this shift in the West particularly. But Henry, you should ask and kind of tell us what you're thinking.
Hi everyone. Hey Misty and DK, thanks for inviting me. Eugene, it's nice to see you. We met like half a decade ago when you tried to recruit me to Oculus Video.
It's been a while, man.
It's good to see you.
Yeah, it's good to see you.
I spent a little bit of this morning rereading through your recent essay, and everything you were writing about TikTok I think is fascinating. And the question that I've been stewing on for the better part of 4 years now is how the types of content that great storytellers, at least that's what we perceive great storytellers here in the West, how the things that they will make will change as a result of the existence of services like TikTok, like Instagram. I'm just wondering, like, what do you think is the role and purpose of a Steven Spielberg or Phoebe Waller-Bridge a decade from now?
Yeah. Well, I'll talk near midterm and then I'll talk super long term. Because in the super long term, I think we will approach what I think of as like this storytelling singularity. At least that's what I call it. But in the near to midterm, generally what I think happens is that we're seeing more production move into the realm of software. And we know that when things become digital bits that can be manipulated, a couple things happen. You know, like Moore's law comes into play, and you start to be able to take advantage of generalized software abstraction. You know, I think in a free market economy, you'd expect that companies like TikTok and people making content will eventually figure out how to abstract things that were previously pretty hard to do in film production. We already see this with some of the filters and effects in TikTok, right? We're like, oh my gosh, you know, I always think about, I'm like, man, it would have been so hard for me to do that in Avid or After Effects. And now it's just like a button you press and it just does the effect for you. And, you know, those effects are, you know, they're kind of amateurish today, but eventually they'll get very powerful. And then you see what's being done with game engines on film and television shoots like The Mandalorian or the Avengers movies. Already, I think people don't realize already that how much TV production is done actually with blue screen and green screen. Mm-hmm. You know, you watch a show, like it could just be some like CSI, whatever, or like, you know, Law and Order. And you're like, oh, why would that show need visual effects? Well, it's because somewhere along the line, rather than close down a couple city blocks in New York to do some like walk and talk on the sidewalk, it just turned out to be cheaper to just shoot that on a soundstage and just like draw in the background of New York. And once you hit that cost inflection point, there's almost no going back, right? Because like TV and film, they're always trying to figure out how to lower their costs so they can make more profit. They operate on a pretty thin margin usually. And so with increased abstraction and Moore's law, I eventually just think like more and more things will be accessible to the amateur, you know. And I think you'll have an entire generation of kids that grow up who already now, this generation of kids, I think it's just much more video production savvy than my generation. Like I never learned anything about film production when I was in grade school or high school or college. There were like no classes. And now kids like do that from an early age. They're figuring out how to shoot and film things. And my niece is 6 and she recorded this like fake intro to what her YouTube channel would be like. And like showed me the video and it was like so funny because she's like, please like and subscribe to my channel. We're going to be showing you how to play Minecraft. It was like the cutest thing. I was like, oh my gosh, like she's already thinking about like filming herself doing something.
Wow.
And broadcasting that to the world. So I think you marry all those trends and it's great because you're going to have a much broader storyteller base, visual storyteller base. And, you know, the number of stories that can be told will be just, you know, explode outwards. And then things like TikTok and things which connect that storytelling community then create kind of like the connective network effects of storytelling, which I think fan fiction was an early version of this, right? With fan fiction, essentially, you know, George Lucas created Star Wars, but now he made a platform for storytelling, and you could go write your Luke Skywalker fan fiction or whatever and use some of his raw material and gain the benefit of the common reference points, right? Like if you did Luke Skywalker fan fiction, I'm assuming someone who reads that also knows what Luke Skywalker's main backstory is in the canon. And so that like library of references or tropes gets richer over time, right? And that's like, I always call fan fiction. Fan fiction to me is just like, to use a crypto analogy, it's just like forking something. You're like, oh, okay, I'm going to fork Star Wars and then tell my own story. I think it's still important that there's a canon, but, you know, after that, like you can play around with it however you want. Now, in the long term, what I call the storytelling singularity is really inspired by my time looking at them using Unreal Engine on the set of The Mandalorian. And I think there's a point at which the game engine quality becomes so good and the computational cost becomes so low that essentially you'll be able to load a script into like an engine, and that engine, like that movie storytelling engine, will just compile your script and then output a movie or 1,000 versions of your movie or 1,000,000 versions. That's the point at which I say the marginal cost of production then becomes essentially zero. Whereas today it costs, it still costs like a couple $100 million to make the Avengers movie. Now imagine that you take that Avengers movie, you're like, I want to make 10 more versions of this Avengers movie. David's going to see one version, Henry's going to see one, Mishi's going to see another, and Eugene will get one. They'll have the same story, but maybe, Henry's a bigger fan of this actor than Eugene is.
That's so interesting.
Wow. And maybe the background will be slightly different. Maybe one of us will want the movie to be in Spanish. And at that point, I think storytelling becomes like potentially personalized and infinitely scalable.
What is the script in your mind? The script is still human created?
Yeah, it can be. But, of course, obviously at some point with GPT-3, you'll be able to have computer created scripts. But, I was always struck when I was in film school that a script really is just like software code. It's a set of instructions, but we wrote screenplays to be interpreted by humans. But what if you wrote a screenplay to be interpreted by a computer? If you look at any scene, there's a slug line. It's like internal, bedroom, nighttime, and it'll describe the action like Eugene opens a book and starts reading, and then it'll have my dialogue. All those are instructions that ultimately could be compiled. Now, when we were in film school, when we were to do previs for our scenes, we either have to just sketch it on a piece of paper with like storyboards, or there was some like really crappy previs software that we could use that school had provided us. It was just so crude. It was just like the little stick drawings and things. And you look at stuff that comes out of Unreal Engine, you're like, oh my God, like this would be way more compelling previs. And today there's just like a huge cost to testing out a screenplay, right? In film school, one of the great exercises you do is you get scripts. People pass around scripts from the Blacklist, which is like the list of top 25 unproduced screenplays in Hollywood. And it's great to read a screenplay before it's actually made into a movie, because it's always easy after the fact to watch a movie and you say, that was terrible. Like, how did people make such a terrible But if you read the screenplay first and we're like, wow, this screenplay is amazing. Like, this will make for a great movie. And then you see the final product and it doesn't work. It tells you how costly the testing process is, right? It's like every startup. Every startup in the Valley, they have this conviction. They're, oh, we have this idea. It's going to change the world. And then, like 99 out of 100 of them just like fail. And you're also like, what happened? Like, how come so many things fail? And it's the same with screenplays. You're like, in the translation, a lot is lost and there's like high risk. But in the storytelling singularity, the cost of taking that risk is zero. You could just test it and you'd be like, oh, this didn't work. Tweak this, tweak that. And I don't know what that'll do to stories, but it will be amazing when that happens.
Are there certain patterns that you can see today that are like typical places that people need to get the ingredients or the recipe right, where that might go off track and get it wrong, that causes the kind of cost overload?
It's odd. I don't know if it's just that it's not teachable or it's just not, I don't know if one of the most popular companies in the Valley has always been Pixar. People are like, oh, Pixar has some magic. And you read all these books on Pixar and, my girlfriend used to work at Pixar. So you talk to all these Pixar people and you're like, oh, how do you guys have such a good hit rate? And what you realize is it's actually just a super costly process of 5, 6, 7 years they go about making a movie where they keep making low res versions of scenes and then just watching them. So they'll have animators just roughly sketch out a scene. They'll have actually voice people. They'll even get some employees to do the voices. Like, does this scene work or not? So I'm not sure it's magic. It's just like brute force testing of whether scenes work dramatically on an audience. And that to me tells me that it's just not that scalable, and it's just hard to tell. There's just something about the creative process where it's hard to formulaically reduce it to something. Now I do think there's a separate question which is sort of interesting. I think Netflix is pushing on this, which is like, what is the minimum viable thing that you will watch? Because I watch a lot of Netflix, these like movies they make and TV shows, and I'm like, oh, this is like, it's not that great. But yeah, I guess I just sat here and watched it. So I guess that's something, right? Like, ultimately, the biggest cost in Hollywood usually is talent. It's like the actors, and like they just like demand to hire. But if you could just like, if Netflix had come up with a formula to just make like good enough work, where they're like, I don't actually need to pay Tom Hanks or like $25 million or whatever. Like, there's like replacement level entertainment. Then that would actually be like a pretty amazing business model where you're like, oh, we put a cap on the cost structure. It's kind of like, what's the name of the producer who does all those like low budget horror? Oh my gosh, I can't believe his name is escaping me right now.
Is this the Bloom company?
Yes, Bloom. Thank you, Bloomhouse. Right, they kind of have that. Like, it's almost like it's almost like a arbitrage strategy where they're like, look, we've studied this. We make movies that cost like 5 to 6, like really low budgets. We may put 1 star in them, like if necessary, but we focus on these sort of like genres where there's like repeatable successes at low cost. And they're like, that way we reliably turn a profit. We may not get, like the $1 billion output, but we're also not going to have the $1 billion bust of a film. So there is like interesting experimentation around that, which is just like, what's like the return on investment? But yeah, ultimately, I'm more interested in the macro trend, which is like, let's just lower the cost of production overall, and let's open production to a wider base of creators, and let's make everything easier for them along the way by connecting them, all these creators, to each other.
Yeah.
That's the power of the internet, right? Like, and software and technology generally. We just haven't applied that to storytelling yet, but now we're starting to see the signs.
Yeah.
And so one of the ways to lower the cost of production is kind of using, approaching the singularity and using Unreal Engine and stuff. To me, that sounds like lower the cost of production on the kind of the 2-hour film. Yeah. But I think there's another way to lower the cost of production, which is like do shorter little experiments that get out. And I think we certainly see some of this in TikTok, and I think this was some of the hypothesis behind Quibi. And can you get some of the a different form factor that is kind of consumable and doesn't require as much investment? Maybe over time you'd end up building out bigger franchises around that. So is there like with a main thrust to that?
Yeah, it also makes me think of like Lil Miquela, and we've kind of when you're talking about the storytelling singularity, like 10 celebrities on Instagram, if they were like Lil Miquela. So just in terms of like experimentation.
Right. In fact, in China, Tencent and WeChat there's this popular class of app in China, which also came to the US, which are these like kind of like choose your own adventure.
Oh yeah.
Fantasy stories. A lot of them are like, they're almost like modern Harlequin romance type things.
It's like Booked in Yarn in the US.
Yeah, a little bit like this. So the ones in China I saw were very funny. It would be like, a lot of them were targeted towards younger women, and it would be like, hey, who's your dream man? Like, do you want to marry like the king, the emperor of China? Do you want to marry like a business tycoon or the actor? And then there's like little like choose your own adventure moments where you choose the thing and you kind of live out this like fantasy romance with them. And what's funny is they've now started to turn some of those into actually filmed little short TV series.
Oh, wow.
And they're like, episode is like 2 minutes, 3 minutes. And, but the IP is already out there because like a number of women have already gone through this like little storyline. So they know the characters and what they're supposed to look like and a little bit of the backstory. So you're already seeing some of that in China. And then ultimately, I think the power of TikTok is just that through its algorithm, they do enforce some sort of feedback loop. Like, I think the way to increase the efficiency and output from a wider pool of experimentation is you do need some, right, selection pressure.
Yeah.
It's like in nature for evolution.
Yeah.
And TikTok's FYP algorithm acts as a collective human plus machine panel of judges that quickly give feedback to the community of like, you made this, it's working. Oh, you made this, it's not working. If you just put tools in the hands of people, but then you don't have that selection pressure, you'll still get evolution, but it might take a really long time. Anyone who's ever, I once helped screen movies for a film festival, and it's like, man, if you've ever been to a film festival and thought, oh, like I saw some bad movies at this film festival, I mean, you don't know like how many extremely terrible movies didn't even make it.
Oh, no.
It's like anything, right? Like if you judge any creative competition, there's like a huge power law in effect.
Yeah.
TikTok, by like sort of scaling it with the design of their app, have essentially made like a much more scalable version of that feedback loop. That's kind of what I think allows that to turbocharge, right? Like to move very quickly. The problem with like older school media operations is that feedback loop just takes so long, It takes you like 3-4 years to line up financing, get your movie finally made. A good example of the Blacklist, a script that like didn't turn into a great movie, was Passengers. I don't know if you saw that with
No.
Chris Pratt and Jennifer Lawrence. It's like that movie in outer space.
Yeah.
So The Passengers was, I had read that when it was on the Blacklist, and I was like, oh, this is a pretty cool story. And they sunk like 100 million plus into it, and it turned out to be a huge bust. And that process from when it was like on the Blacklist to when it got made to when it finally hit the market and it got like that negative feedback was like 6-7 years. I don't know. It was like a really long time.
Yeah.
And imagine like you make a TikTok and like in one day you're going to know if that's going to be a thing or not. They show it to a bunch of people. TikTok, what's funny about TikTok is once they show your video to like the first 1,000 users and they get a reaction, most of those videos will never be seen again. Like the algorithm will never show them to a single person. And that's just crazy. I'm sure it's the same for YouTube. Like there's a lot of videos that like no one will ever watch. They'll never be found. But TikTok just like makes that, right, that weeding out process happen very, very quickly.
Do you think that first 1,000 is like, in a sense, structured to be a panel of tastes? Like, so it's kind of carefully, this is older and younger, and this is more into music and more into dance and different kind of panel flavors that they know what people respond to?
Yeah, I mean, they do put stuff through a little bit of like human tagging, like video tagging and screening for like moderation purposes. And then they, of course, have the tags that the user applies to that video themselves. But after that, they just like have an algorithm that selects like 1,000 people to show the video to. You'll see if you're on TikTok, occasionally you get that video that has like no views, likes. You're like, oh, I'm on the judging panel for this video. You're like, I'm going to determine whether anyone will ever see this video again. It's pretty funny.
Right.
But it's a very clever design on their part.
Yeah, that design, I think, I've thought about it a lot in the context that you've written about it, after having read your writing, and it's, I think, really informed a lot of my thinking and kind of media tools. The only thing that I can think of that's anywhere near it is kind of, and it's a very different space, but the kind of one piece of media and make a judgment is kind of the Tinder swiping mechanism. Yeah. And I wonder, that's one that's not in the video format. So it's like in a photo format, but it's a highly like marketplace transaction, that has like, very well understood outcomes. And I wonder, like, do you think that there's other places where that idea of like single piece of media and some sort of like decision, either consumption or swiping, is creates that type feedback loop? Like, can we see something like this in writing somewhere? Can there be like a mini blog format where you sort of get the yes or no signal, like read a mini blog? I'm almost thinking of something longer than a tweet but shorter than a medium. Has anybody done anything interesting there? Is that a place for opportunity?
I mean, in a way, The Martian was kind of written that way.
Really?
So the author who wrote The Martian first started publishing it on a blog and getting feedback from like space experts. People would just be like, here's the next chapter. And people would give all these notes to him on that. And, he kind of crowdsourced his scientific panel from the masses in a way, which I thought was kind of cool. I mean, that's one of the advantages of like writing in public, in sort of a newsletter or blog format, chapter by chapter. Honestly, like, I feel like that's not even like this sort of like judging a piece of work is not like anything new to pedagogy or, the world, right? We have many competitions, right, many forms of teaching that use this type of method. It's just that with apps and the internet, you can open that up to a much broader base. Like when I was doing short story writing in college, of course, you have to write your story, print out like a bunch of copies, give it to classmates, and then they have to read it and mark it up a few times, and then they give you your feedback in class. And they generally use short stories because it would take too long to write a novel in one semester. So that was just like breaking it down. They're trying to teach you to be a writer from the shortest possible format. Mm-hmm. And I think there's many things, right? Like if you take tennis lessons or golf lessons, right? They're always giving you this like constant feedback on like one part of your game. They don't try to teach you everything all at once. So I think we do know, right? Like we actually do know how to teach people well. And the question is, how do you translate that into the modern world? I think you have things like Coursera, Masterclass, like that are sort of dabbling in what that kind of instruction looks like. I don't know that any of them have cracked it yet. Like I haven't tried any online courses where I'm like, wow, that just like pulled me all the way through it. Michael Nielsen and Andy Matichak have tried experimenting with this new form of book that will improve your recall using spaced repetition. So they have an online book on quantum computing. That's a pretty interesting experiment in what a book would look like if it was trying to maximize your recall and learning rather than just be a traditional book. So there are spaced repetition techniques used to kind of quiz you over time or like, implant these like sort of concepts in your brain. So I think we're starting to get experiments with that. I just don't think we've seen like the breakthrough form yet, but I'm glad people are experimenting with it. Because ultimately, if you can experiment and get to a form that is a little bit like, I don't know if you've read Diamond Age by Neil Stephenson, but, like the Ladies Illustrated Primer is this idea of a computing device that like personalizes its teaching to the user over time.
Oh, that's cool.
That would be like the dream, right? To have these devices in the hands of every student in the world, and that each device would personalize its teaching techniques to each person. We're still a long ways from that. So I think there's a lot of room to really figure out how to do that. Even what you do with Highlighter, right? You're trying to give people another view onto a lot of material that they encountered in one specific way, and figuring out whether you can, I don't know, turn that into some other form that, sinks in more effectively.
DK, in a related way about this like Tinder swiping
I think
yes
the
or
highlighting
no
concept
as a way to get approval of. Can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Sorry about
Oh,
that
go ahead.
delay.
I think I'm a little delayed. Yeah, sorry. Go ahead.
Got it. On this idea of like using Tinder swipes or like simple gestural ways to understand if people like a piece of content or whether a person is attractive or not. I've been thinking and reading a little bit about the changes in fast fashion over the last decade. And if I think about like when I was growing up in the 90s and early 2000s, like clothes would be out on shelves for months at a time before they finally went on sale. But like the rise of Zara about 10 years ago meant that like, clothes might sit on a shelf for, a couple of weeks before they went on sale. And one of the cool things that I've been reading about is how with live streaming and e-commerce apps in China, a live streamer will basically hold up a prototype or something and say like, do you guys want this? And if like 1,000 people upvote it, like the manufacturer like will create on demand that prototype that they have. And so it's kind of changing the model of like, some fashion buyer goes to like a Gucci fashion show and predicts what people want to buy 6 months from now. And so you just go direct to the consumer and say, do you want this? If so, it'll be ready for production if like 1,000 people upvote this thing in the next 3 minutes. I think it's like a fascinating way to change the idea of like how people wear, how they want to like creatively express themselves. That's not a question. It's just a reaction to what you guys have been discussing.
Yeah. I mean, in the distant future, right, with a 3D printer in every home, you also just increase the feasibility of sort of that level of like real-time personalization. We just,
like, do we lose anything when you think about the storytelling singularity and increasingly rapid experimentation and increasing personalization? Like, is there something we lose as storytellers or as consumers? Like, is there a shared basis for connection across groups? Or I'm trying to think of what other side effects there might be along with what we're talking about.
For sure. I've said before, I think the optimal governance size of a nation state is shrinking because of the internet, especially in the West. I just feel like when you lose these like grand shared narratives because everybody can get like a narrative that's more personalized to them, it's just harder to hold things together. I think our leaders of like the United States, our politicians and things still operate in an old school model of media, which is like the centralized media. It's like television, newspaper, and they're like, hey, this is what America stands for, And in the modern era, they're still sort of like adhering to that model of media when most of its citizens have moved to the internet and are on like subreddits and things and finding their own like little communities. And so we're starting to see this, right? Like we're starting to see this in the debate over what is America about? Is America a just society? What is like the history of America? What is its founding narrative? And that debate is causing what feels like an increased level of polarization. And, I think I saw a study that was really interesting. Most people who live in the top urban cities around the world, they feel a greater kinship or they're more closely tied
I saw that.
thoughts to other urban dwellers around the world, more so than, the people who live maybe like 80 miles east of them in some rural community. Just the value system is being driven by the internet and less by the leaders of a nation state. And I think you can see evidence of this by looking at the counterexamples like China, where they were like, oh my gosh, the internet is going to like tear our country apart. So we're going to have to moderate and censor the internet to a degree never seen before in human history. Because otherwise, like, we are going to tear apart at the seams. There's no way for the CCP to maintain governance over, over 1 billion people if they just have like a free and open internet. So I think that is one thing that's lost. And I do think there is that yearning, right, for shared narratives. Why are the Marvel movies so popular? I don't think like so many people are into superhero movies or anything, but they do provide like common reference points. So I think what the internet does is like you still will have those like blockbusters that everybody has heard of. And you'll have some of them, but you also have like a much longer tail. So you have this kind of like barbell in storytelling. I think there was one period where people thought the internet would like totally eliminate blockbusters, or only create blockbusters because of network effects. And the truth is we have like kind of both now.
Right, but like a more diverse ecosystem of long tail creators and audiences that can be found and connected.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The grand.
One interesting.
Oh, go ahead.
One thing that came up earlier, we were talking to Tina from Pace, who does like fake pixels. She was talking about the idea of kind of, instead of one Netflix, you might have like A24, was it? That would have their own Netflix, or you could have like people subscribe to production agencies or individuals and have like a very personal, deep relationship with those kind of, I don't know, content or interest specific distributors of film or content. As the tail gets longer, sort of like what are the kind of aggregate groups that will be empowered instead of having to go through like a massive distributor to be able to build their own base.
I mean, distributors have to earn their keep, right?
Yeah.
Like, what's the value? I mean, we do see that, like, there's probably some max level of subscriptions that I can, like, manage of, like, like creators and Substacks and, all these things. I can't, like, manage an infinite number of them. But certainly for some of them, right, the middleman was unnecessary, and having a direct relationship feels better for me.
Yeah.
And the question for distributors is, how do they win in that world? Like, can they create a bundle that makes sense? I think you could take the Netflix strategy, which is like, we'll try to be something for everybody, which is, you see how much they spend on content, right? It's like more than any other company in the world.
Yeah.
Or you could be like, well, I'll be something to some people, which is like the Disney approach, right? Like I have my Disney Plus subscription since when it started, and honestly, like I haven't watched that much on it. There's not that much, but they like pick their lane. They're like, we're not going to be Netflix. We're not going to do everything. Mm-hmm. We have like these huge grand universes of franchises. That's kind of what we focus on. I'm working on a piece contrasting those two, because I feel like they illustrate most cleanly this like binary approach to things, where as a distributor, I think what you don't want to be is like in the middle, or you don't want to be like, try to be everything to everybody, but if you can't spend as much as Netflix, then you're just like a smaller version of it. Yeah. That doesn't work either. Same for music, right? Like music is sort of even more powerfully that way. Like you're either Spotify or Apple Music and you have like just about everything, mm-hmm. or you're probably going to be super, super niche. Yeah. You're like appealing to classical music fans who want to hear music in like super high bit rates or something like that. Yeah. There's just like, it's very hard to be like Tidal, which is like, Tidal is just like a random thing that was like not anything.
Yeah. And like, what will the extremes be of both of those ends of the spectrum? Like one other thing that came up is, will Netflix start empowering people to produce their own like series of like their own family drama live streamed, and they have their like, how basically like, how much can you have something for everyone? And does that involve at some point, like letting people make their own stuff for their own groups? And then what's the other side of the spectrum where it's like, how niche can you get? Yeah. And how does what are interesting ways that you cater more and more to an increasingly specific niche?
Yeah. Yeah. I don't know. It'll be interesting.
Yeah. Cool. Well, I know we're over the hour that we already agreed to spend, and I appreciate you taking the time. So I don't want to hold you over too long.
No problem.
But we do appreciate getting your thoughts on this stuff. And if you've got any kind of new pieces coming up or interesting people that you think of that we should be talking to about video, we'd love to always loop them in and learn from them and learn from you. So hope we can do it again sometime soon.
Definitely. Yeah, keep me posted as you work on this video stuff. Happy to give notes and feedback.
Yeah, we've got one of the big things that's going to be coming out very shortly. I think we're probably a few weeks away, but we actually have a highlight format that lives on platform.
Oh, okay. Cool.
you can see kind of what we're doing right now is we're just creating, an hour worth of video, but we'll actually distill the best 5 minutes and then have it able to be consumed on platform in that kind of highlight format. So
awesome.
Via text as well. Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Great.
So we'll share that out when we get that.
Yeah, it's good to see you both again.
Cool.
Yeah.
Good to see you, Eugene.
Thanks so much.
Thanks, man.
All right. Take care. Have a good day.